When someone thinks of guns in the context of the Air Force, they are most likely thinking of aerial machine guns, or cannons attached to aircraft than they are small arms. Given that an Air Force's entire purpose is battling in and from the skies, a pistol that an airman is unlikely to ever use, even in a large war, seems inconsequential. Nevertheless, the U.S. Air Force, through unusual circumstances, eccentric personalities, and inter-service rivalry, has had an overlooked impact on U.S. small arms procurement and development. Those of you that enjoy military or firearm history can hopefully gain some knowledge that may be new to you.
In this video, I'll give an overview of the major pistols in a mostly chronological order that are or were in the U.S. Air Force inventory and how they got there.
We'll start in the year that the Air Force was created, 1947, with the primary handgun at the time, the M1911 A1. The U.S. Army adopted the earliest version of the pistol in 1911 and sought to standardize it across the entire service. The pistols would be modified after the First World War in response to lessons learned, and this new pistol would be designated the M1911 A1. This configuration would be the one that stuck around until they were largely phased out in the late 1980s. The M1911s were carried by Army Air Force pilots, aircrew, and military police throughout World War II. All AAF M1911s were purchased through the Department of the Army and would have been labeled U.S. Army on the right side of the frame. During the war, the M1911 A1 was made by 5 different manufacturers: Colt, Remington Rand, Ithaca, Union Switch and Signal, and Singer. All of these different types could have been issued to airmen, but the small batch of 500 1911 A1s manufactured by Singer were issued exclusively to the AAF before the company sent all its tooling to Remington Rand, allowing Singer to focus on the various fire control systems like the M5 artillery directive for the war effort. For collectors of the pistol, these are the most valuable. Remington Rand 1911 A1s were likely the most common types found in AAF service since they made the most pistols of any manufacturer during the war. Colt would have been a close second. Despite their service record, the newly minted U.S. Air Force wasn't enamored with the gun. As the decades rolled by, the 1911s would be sidelined by various types of 38 caliber revolvers. The replacement of a semi-automatic 45 caliber pistol with 38 revolvers likely seems counterintuitive to many, but let's examine some of the likely reasons. I say likely because there was never one clearly stated reason, and what does exist is often speculative. For one, the bulkiness of the pistol and its associated holster, combined with flight gear and the often confined spaces in an aircraft, convinced some pilots and aircrew to leave them behind when on a mission. As the Air Force adopted more planes with ejection seats, there was a need to lighten the pilot's equipment as much as possible, and revolvers provided an alternative, but more on those later. The Air Force Military Police, at this point called the Air Police, placed their 1911 A1s with Smith & Wesson Model 10s and 15s. The armament and culture around air-based security and small arms training in the Air Force's early days was heavily influenced by General Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay joined the Army Air Corps in 1929 and was a major by the time of the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. He saw action in both Europe and the Pacific, where he planned the large firebombing and sea mining campaign against Japan. He was especially fond of guns and shooting, and he was the man responsible for introducing the U.S. military to the AR-15. It was assumed by many that he believed that one of the 1911's major drawbacks was that it was difficult to become proficient with it in a short amount of time and on a small budget. If so, he was not the only one. The U.S. Army was aware of this flaw as well and had purchased several 22 caliber 1911s to train recruits with, but not in large numbers. This lack of proficiency and its tiny sight picture gave many GIs the impression that it was inaccurate. Getting someone who is new to firearms proficient enough to hit a man-sized target under stress is easier to do with a revolver, especially if they have smaller hands, or so the thinking goes. It's better to hit with a lighter 38 Special than miss with a 45 ACP. Airmen who required concealable pistols would trade theirs in for one of several types of snub-nosed 38s as well. However, in the late 80s, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations would take old 1911s from the Department of the Navy and modify them to be more concealable. These pistols are called the Air Force Custom Combat 45 Autos, or just the OSI 1911s. The front of the trigger guard was squared off and, along with the front of the grip, stippled for greater texture. The barrel and slide was shortened by 1.905 cm and the frame by 1.27 cm. A new ramp-style front sight was installed and the GI-style safety lever was replaced with a wider one. In order for the magazine to be flush with the bottom of the shortened grip, a new 6-round magazine with a finger rest protruding from the front was developed. One of these custom magazines and 2 standard ones were issued alongside each pistol. Despite these pistols only costing around $100, only a few were made, and it's unclear if there were enough to arm each agent in the OSI. It is also hard to tell if each one followed the same pattern or was sourced from the US Navy. The one in the photos is clearly labeled US Army. The OSI 1911 should not be confused with the M15 General Officer's Pistol, which was also issued to some Air Force generals between 1972 and 1981. The M15s had a full-size frame and were built to have a much more distinguished appearance than a standard pistol. It also came with black leather accessories such as a belt, holster, and magazine pouches. Metal pieces like the belt buckles would be gold-colored for the Army and silver for the Air Force. Finally, some competitive shooting teams would have highly modified 1911s called U.S. Air Force Premium Grade National Match Pistols. These were custom pistols built for the Air Force Marksmanship Program, and to be accepted, the pistol must be capable of achieving 3 consecutive 10-shot groups at 50 yards that were no wider than 3 inches. The exact modifications varied over the years, but they all would have been stamped with the letters AFPG on the weapon. To recap, the M1911 A1 was in service when the Air Force became its own branch in 1947. There were 4 types: the standard GI model, the General Officer's model, called the M15, the OSI model, and the Air Force Premium Grade model. Despite not being an institutional favorite, there were still a number of airmen that would only require a sidearm under special circumstances. In those cases, the M1911 would be a common substitute if no revolvers were available. The 1911 would not be fully replaced until the introduction of the M9 and the M11.
The 1911 was not the only handgun in service with the Air Force during World War II. As the U.S. military was drastically increasing its size during the war, there was a shortage of handguns. Vast quantities of 38 Special revolvers were purchased to serve as alternate standard handguns. It was planned that people like factory guards on the home front would be equipped with these revolvers and that this would free up more 1911s for deployed ground forces, but these revolvers would see action in foreign theaters throughout the war and in the subsequent decades. The 38 Military and Police is the first 6-shot K-frame revolver and was first introduced to the U.S. military in 1899. It was the first Smith & Wesson to have a swing-out cylinder. While it wasn't standard issue, it was bought in large numbers, and by World War II, it was the most prominent alternate standard handgun in the inventory. This was helped by the fact that Smith & Wesson's rival, Colt, was so occupied with manufacturing the M1911 A1 that their answer to the M&P, the Colt Commando, couldn't always meet the numbers necessary to fulfill a contract on time. The Victory models are just M&Ps standardized onto the 38 Special, a barrel length of 4 inches, though 2-inch versions were also produced, a square butt with a lanyard loop, and a serial prefix with the letter V in it, for victory against the Axis. The numbering went from V1 to V769,000, but when an accidental discharge, caused by the revolver being dropped, killed a U.S. Navy sailor, this forced Smith & Wesson to install a new safety block system. Revolvers produced after it was installed would have the prefix SV, the S meaning safety. Revolvers sent back to the factory to have the hammer block installed would have the S printed on it as well. The SV series would continue from SV 769,001 to SV 811,119. After this point, the V would be dropped. Whatever capacity the Army Air Force used them in, if at all, is unclear, but they started to show up in U.S. Air Force service regularly after the war. Since the Air Force didn't exist as a separate service when their production stopped, all of the Victory models in service would have been inherited from either the Army or the Navy. Veterans reported being issued with revolvers from either service. The most visible instance was in the elite guard units. These were ceremonial guard units stood up by a major command, most famously Strategic Air Command, but there are others as well. The first was formed in 1956 at the direction of General LeMay, and according to an article uploaded on SACEliteGuard.com, they adopted a chrome-plated 38 Special with a 4-inch barrel and bone grips and a cross-draw holster. None of the documents I found specify a model. At most, they'll say Smith & Wesson. Photos show a lanyard loop consistent with a Victory model, and it was the 50s, so that's what I'm going with. Commercial Model 10s, which are just post-World War II M&Ps, were also purchased by the military. In 1960, shortly after the order to destroy the M13 aircrewmans, more on those in a sec, the U.S. Air Force bought 922 round-butt Model 10s with 2-inch barrels. I speculate that these were bought as a stopgap measure until the KTX-38, which I'll get into shortly, was developed in 1962. Air Force Technical Order 35C2-3-445-1 mentions the 4-inch models with round and square butts as well. What these Model 10s were used for and what became of them is unknown. Reports of Victory models being issued to airmen continued until at least the Gulf War with Air Reserve and Air National Guard tanker and transport air crews. The Colt Commando, not to be confused with the carbine, has a story that almost mirrors the Smith & Wesson M&P and Victory model revolvers perfectly. They served as alternate standard handguns alongside the Smith & Wessons, but to a lesser degree. It is the cheaper version of the Colt official police revolver and standardized on 2 or 4-inch barrels. It lacked some of the finer details like checkering on the trigger and cylinder latch. The finish wasn't polished and the grips were plastic. Despite being an alternate standard, these revolvers made their way to the front line in some capacity. General Eisenhower allegedly carried one. The last recorded purchase of the Commandos by the U.S. military was three 4-inch barrel models on 17 August 1945 to the Army Air Force in-transit depot in Long Beach, California. These are the only recorded Commandos to have been purchased by the Air Force, but if the Smith & Wessons are any indication, then it is possible more were transferred from the other services post-war. There is some anecdotal evidence for this.
The 1911 A1 was seen as a heavy and cumbersome piece of flight equipment that could potentially come loose and strike a crewman if he had to eject, thus being more likely to cause harm than prevent it. The Air Force worked with both Colt and Smith & Wesson to develop a lightweight, compact 38 special revolver called the M13 aircrewman. This designation would apply to several different patterns of pistol from both manufacturers. The standard catalog of Smith & Wesson 4th edition mentions up to 9 variations for just the Smith & Wesson entries. What they all have in common is that they had either 2 or 3-inch barrels and were made almost entirely of an aluminum alloy. The Colt entry is virtually the same as their commercial detective special, just aluminum. They also had Air Force medallions in the grips, Air Crewman on the barrel, property of U.S. Air Force on the backstrap, and AF No prefix on the butt. Colt made 1,189 of these Air Crewmans and they were numbered sequentially 1 through 1,189. No further purchases of the Colts were made. Smith & Wesson submitted 2 frame sizes with their first batch, each consisting of 605 revolvers for a total of 1,210 units. The first size was a 6-shot K-frame revolver, and the second was a smaller 5-shot J-frame revolver, known colloquially as the Baby Air Crewman. Both sizes would feature Air Force medallions in their grips, have U.S. Air Force marked on the backstrap, and Air Crewman on the barrel. The early K-frames were identical to commercial M&P airweight revolvers except for the markings, but some have tried to pass off commercial versions as military M13s by labeling the backstrap, so any collectors should keep that in mind before buying one. The serial numbers of the Smith & Wesson revolvers picked up where the Colts left off, 1,190 to 1,794 for the K-frames and 1,795 to 2,399 for the J-frames. The Air Force settled on the Smith & Wesson K-frame from this point onward and bought an estimated 40,000 M13s. These would have a few changes to them, like having revolver lightweight M13 printed on the top strap, U.S. Air Force medallions in the grips being replaced with standard Smith & Wesson ones, and in later models, the property of U.S. Air Force on the backstrap being replaced with just U.S., or sometimes kept blank. The use of these revolvers had expanded to the AFOSI and Army CID, and the Army likely didn't want to issue a gun that said property of U.S. Air Force on it. These revolvers were only bought between 1951 and 1957, because the alloy in their construction made them unsafe to fire, even with the M41 ball ammunition which was specifically designed for these guns. In September 1959, the Air Force directed that all M13s be mutilated to prevent further use as a weapon. However, the task of doing this fell to individual units, and consequently, some ended up in private collections instead.
As mentioned before, the Air Force didn't hold the M1911 in high regard. Sure, it could get the job done, and they would be in inventory up to the 1980s, but they still had some flaws. One being that the production had stopped and no new ones were coming. The other being the 1911 style handgun wasn't widely considered a beginner-friendly pistol. This is especially concerning if the organization issuing them is working on a limited time and a small budget. The Air Force is more concerned with putting planes in the air and ordnance on the ground than it is with whether or not its airmen can shoot straight, especially considering how unlikely it is for the average airman to get into a gunfight. With the 1911 being the standard issue sidearm of the U.S. military, the Air Force needed to get clever, and in 1960 they had a solution. Individual services are allowed to purchase non-standard equipment to meet special requirements. The Air Force made the case that aircrew and base security had special requirements that needed special equipment. That special piece of equipment was the Smith & Wesson Model 15 Combat Masterpiece, not to be confused with the M15 General Officer pistol. The Model 15 is a full-size K-frame 6-shot 38 caliber revolver with a 4-inch barrel. The configuration selected by the Air Force included adjustable target sights, a widened target trigger, a widened target hammer, and Magna grips. The only difference between a civilian model of the same configuration and an Air Force one is that an Air Force one will have USAF marked on the left side of the frame. Because these are easy to fake and records are spotty, there are a number of forgeries in the civilian market. The only way to know if a revolver is real or not is to get an authentication letter from Smith & Wesson. Seriously, it's not hard to find a civilian Model 15 in the approximate serial number range and configure it to look authentic. Mine only lacks the USAF markings. All of the features for target shooting might seem rather curious for a combat handgun, but keep in mind the Air Force's priorities. One clever way of improving marksmanship scores is to issue a pistol designed more for target shooting, and the Model 15, paired with the very low recoil M41 ball ammunition, is far more comfortable to shoot than the M1911. I don't want to give the impression that the combat masterpiece isn't a capable handgun. It is, but the importance of marksmanship scores is evident when you look at the way the gun is configured. The Air Force would buy these revolvers from 1960 to 1969 across the Dash 1, 2, and 3 versions. These different versions denote minor changes that Smith & Wesson made throughout their production. The exact numbers aren't known, but a report from 1975 about the feasibility of converting the revolvers to 9mm mentioned having a service-wide inventory of over 100,000. Some veterans report that a 2-inch barrel version was also issued at the time, and this may be true. However, I think it's likely that they may have actually seen the KTX-38s, also called the Model 56. Shortly after the order to destroy the Model 13s, the Air Force made a purchase of 15,205 square-butt K-frame .38 caliber revolvers with 2-inch barrels for its OSI agents. These are the KTX-38s. Curiously, these revolvers also have features normally seen on a target revolver, like its adjustable rear sight, despite the revolver being a snub nose. The backstrap has US printed on it and is otherwise similar to commercial Model 15s. So similar, in fact, that the KTX-38 was discontinued when 2-inch barrels were offered as a purchase option for the Model 15, making the KTX redundant. All the purchases of the KTX-38s were made between 1962 and 1963. It's not known how long they were in service for, but it's believed that the vast majority have since been destroyed, though some still show up on the civilian market for more than $10,000. By the mid-1970s, the Air Force was having ammunition problems. The M41 ball ammunition was old and in short supply. Airmen were experiencing bullets obstructing the barrel or their revolvers outright detonating. I'll get into how the Air Force addressed this problem when we cover the Beretta M9. The Model 15s were the standard issue for most of the Air Force until the adoption of the Beretta M9. Even then, the revolver would still be in use for training military working dogs, since the revolver was able to fire blank ammunition without modification. These revolvers have, or are going to be, replaced by the Sauer M18. The Smith & Wesson Model 41 is a .22 caliber single-action target pistol. The Air Force bought 30 of them in 1967 and shipped them to the Arthur Cook Supply Company. Cook was an Olympic gold medalist and later commissioned into the Air Force to form its shooting team. His company allegedly modified firearms for the CIA. What modifications he made or where they went after is unknown. In 1967, the Air Force began issuing this 9mm semi-automatic pistol to general officers. This is the Model 39. They were bought straight from the factory without any markings and are indistinguishable from commercial ones, the only exception being the one that was presented to General LeMay. It was engraved and nickel-plated. Some were reportedly used for other purposes, but what these purposes were is unknown. Maybe they were modified with a slide lock and sound suppressor like the Seal Mark 22 Mod 0 hush puppies. Smith & Wesson developed the Model 59 as an improved version of the Model 39 Hush Puppy variants and developed an aluminum-framed prototype in the early 1970s for the Air Force. How many were made and what became of them is unknown. In 1971, the Air Force OSI purchased approximately 1,500 J-frame Model 36-1 revolvers with round butts and 3-inch heavy barrels. The letters OSI were stamped on the side plate and frame, but it's unclear if the stamping was done by the Air Force or Smith & Wesson. The exact configuration is a bit of a mystery. Some report that the revolvers had target hammers and triggers like the Model 15, but most people don't get more specific than Model 36. Agents seem to have some freedom with what grips could be put on it. Some used banana target grips and others didn't. The adoption of these revolvers allegedly came from agents wanting to have a weapon more concealable than the 4-inch Model 15s they were carrying. Some say it came at the suggestion of the U.S. Secret Service. Others say it came from agents' experience in Vietnam. The photos I am showing you right now are from the Smith & Wesson forum, and I can't vouch for their authenticity. Why the KTX-38s or the commercial Model 10s weren't being used isn't known. The OSI tried to replace them with the modified 1911s that I mentioned earlier, but some Model 36s were probably still in use by the time the M9 was introduced. The Air Force's attempt at addressing the issues with the M41 ball ammunition was to try converting the M15s to 9mm. Both Smith & Wesson and the Air Force experimented with different conversion kits. According to the Air Force, theirs was better. Either way, these plans were scrapped and the Air Force put in a request to the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee to develop a newer .38 special cartridge instead. This request revealed that there was no real standardization with respect to firearms. Congress was not pleased with there being so many different models of pistols and their associated ammunition types in the DoD. By their count, there was up to 25 different pistols in service across the entire military, and this seemed like a wasteful duplication. The Air Force request was denied, but Congress offered to fund an entirely new pistol program that would seek to replace and standardize the military sidearms while also bringing it to the 9mm NATO standard. This would be the Joint Service Small Arms Program, JSSAP, of 1977. This was great news for the Air Force since a new .38 special cartridge would not address the problem of old revolvers needing replacement. Many of the revolvers were worn out by this point, and the ability to repair or rebuild them was beyond the ability of most Air Force armorers. That was assuming they could be rebuilt at all. Because of their immediate concern, the Air Force was selected to evaluate potential candidates. The Air Force Armament Lab, AFAL, developed a list of requirements that a pistol would have to meet. 1. Be chambered for 9mm NATO cartridge. 2. Have detachable magazines with a minimum capacity of 13 rounds. 3. Have a magazine release that operated by the right hand, allowing the release magazine to fall away without assistance from the left hand. 4. Double or single action. 5. Have a slide stop to lock the slide open after the last shot is fired. 6. No jam under adverse conditions and, during a 5,000 round test, have no more than 8 significant malfunctions. There was also detailed consideration for the safety system. The thumb safety had to be ambidextrous. There had to be a decocker that didn't involve touching the trigger, and the firing pin had to be locked in place when the gun's safety was activated. Once these needs were met, the pistol would then be set against the M1911 and the M15 revolver for reliability, followed by a range test in which the pistols would be fired by Air Force personnel of various skill levels to see how scores would be affected. The overall winner was the Beretta 92. It had met the requirements set out by the program, and accuracy scores showed dramatic improvement, especially with new shooters. Throwing a wrench in all this, though, was the U.S. Army. They were not thrilled with the idea that the Air Force would be the ones deciding what the Joint Force pistol would be. Soldiers were the largest group of users for pistols, after all. They focused on how the Air Force had measured the performance of factory new candidate pistols against pistols that had been in military circulation for years. Many of the malfunctions that the 1911 experienced was due to old magazines that hadn't been replaced in many years, and this had invalidated the tests as far as the Army was concerned. In 1981, the Army conducted another series of tests and determined that none of the pistols met the requirements and canceled the program. The perception of bias from the point of view of the manufacturers forced the Army to carry out a third test. The third test of 1984 was given the project name XM9. Only the Beretta 92 and the Sig Sauer P226 made it to the bidding phase, which Beretta won. The first contract of 315,930 pistols was awarded on April 10, 1985. For the Air Force, this was a huge upgrade. Airmen would be trading in old 5 or 6 shot revolvers with underpowered ammunition for new high-capacity semi-automatic pistols with modern 9mm ammunition. Training and procurement was now largely standardized on one pistol with one cartridge, but it would not be without controversy, and it wouldn't replace every pistol in inventory. Most infamously, between 1985 and 1988, Army and Navy testers documented at least 14 instances where the Beretta slide failed, sending parts flying off the back of the gun. In 4 of those cases, the shooter was seriously injured. The problem was wrongly attributed to the gun, but what had happened was that some of the new 9mm ammunition was being improperly manufactured. The ammunition was loaded to much higher pressure than it was supposed to. Nobody in the military knew how much of the overloaded ammunition was still in circulation, so Beretta, at U.S. government expense, had devised a new safety system that would catch the slide in the event of a detonation. Still, the pistol's reputation and the reputation of Beretta as a company was so damaged that they sued the U.S. government and won. The other problem was size. The pistol was too big to be carried for certain duties that required plainclothes and concealment. The M11 would be chosen for this role. I'll talk about those in a moment. Several other problems cropped up as the years went by that likely soured its reputation among some veterans. First was the locking block wearing out. This part requires a replacement sooner than the other components. Often this wasn't done until a breakage, and they would sometimes be replaced with third-party manufactured parts instead of coming from Beretta. Second was the magazine. The military desired a second source for magazines and contracted with a company called Checkmate to provide them. These magazines had a finish coating that would induce feed malfunctions in dusty and sandy conditions, like those in the Middle East. This was not a problem for magazines made by Beretta. Finally, for the Air Force, the M9 couldn't reliably feed the blank ammunition used for acclimatization of the military working dogs to the sound of gunfire. The M15 was retained for this purpose. There were 4 variations of the M9 in Air Force service. First, the normal model. Second is the General Officer model. This was introduced in 1986 as a replacement for the M15 General Officer's model. They are the same as a regular M9 except it has a GO prefix added to its serial number. Third is the Air Force competition version. Lastly was the Hush Puppy version. Much like the Smith & Wesson Model 39 from the Vietnam era, this pistol was modified to accept a slide lock and sound suppressor. These were bought for use in pilot survival kits, though it's unclear if they were ever used. The Air Force bought approximately 3,800. All combined, the M9 is the most procured pistol since World War II. As mentioned before, a niche that the newly acquired M9 couldn't fill was the need for a compact pistol for the personnel that would carry their weapons concealed. In the Air Force, this was usually a requirement for the AFOSI. The SIG P226 may have lost the competition to be the standard issue pistol of the U.S. military, but it would still see service with the U.S. Navy SEALs and was a big commercial success. SIG made a shorter in length and height version of the gun called the SIG P228. In January 1992, the U.S. Army began formal testing of the 228. A solicitation was sent the following April, and by October, the military specifications for the XM11 was officially published. The first batch of 600 M11s was sent to AFOSI by 1993. 25,000 would be procured DoD-wide. There are two types in circulation. Type 1 has 3-dot sights, while Type 2 has tritium glow sights. According to Air Force TO 11W3-3-4-11, the Air Force exclusively uses Type 1. These pistols have been or are currently being replaced by the Sauer M18. Specifics about Glocks in Air Force service are sparse. Advertisements from Glock mention Glock 19s being used by pilots in the Air Force, but official sources only mention Glock 19s being used by some members of the Air Force Special Tactics as an alternative to the M9. Online rumors suggest that some pilots were allowed to purchase privately owned Glocks during the first Gulf War due to a shortage of pistols, but that can't be substantiated. The Glocks in use with Special Tactics appear to be Generation 3 Model 19s. Precisely why, when, and how these were adopted is a bit of a mystery, but the Glock 19 was adopted SOCOM-wide in 2016, and this is likely how they showed up in Special Tactics. It isn't known yet if the new M18s will replace them, but documents suggest the Air Force will not support the pistols anymore. This doesn't mean that they'll be phased out. There are other budgetary means that could be used to procure more, like unit discretionary funds. Studies during the War on Terror about service member confidence in their various weapon systems have shown that the M9 was the most universally disliked. Only 58% of troops who had used it in combat reported feelings of satisfaction with the weapon. Most frequent complaints were related to the M882 9mm NATO ball ammunition and its perceived lack of stopping power. A lack of reliability was also a cause for concern. Most users identified the magazines as being the likely cause, but interestingly, the study also suggested the M9 was more reliable when using non-government issued lubricant. Other problems included the weapon's age, the grips and overall handling, the lack of attachments, and inadequate training. In 2011, the U.S. Army announced the modular handgun system program to replace the M9 and the M882 9mm NATO ball round. The DoD received a total of 12 bids for what promised to be a lucrative contract. Beretta had tried to sidestep the competition by offering an upgraded version of the M9 called the M9A3 that addressed many of the issues that had been identified with the previous version, with the added benefit of being compatible with many pistol accessories already in service. However, the Army rejected this. The XM17 trial itself was controversial. The 12 bids were reduced to two finalists, Glock and Sig Sauer. The next step would have been a second round of product verification testing that would have seen the entrants subjected to rigorous environmental and endurance testing. But Sig Sauer was declared the winner in 2017 before they could be carried out. No reason for this was ever stated publicly. The Sig Sauer entrant was two identical but different sized pistols, the M17 full-sized and the more compact M18. The U.S. Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps all decided to adopt the M18 exclusively. By 2020, the first units in the Air Force began to arrive. These are in the process of replacing all the M9s, M11s, and with a blank fire adapter kit, all the remaining M15s as well. It is unclear if the M18s will replace the Glocks in use by Special Tactics, but only time will tell. Along with the base model M18 will be the General Officer model. Like the General Officer model of the M9, the only difference will be the GO in the serial number. In June of 2021, the Air Force Materiel Command, AFMC, sent out a request to the industry for 3,015 conversion kits that would make the M18 even more compact. Who they are for isn't known, but speculation is that they are going to AFOSI or Special Tactics. Before we go, I did want to tell one air combat story concerning a pistol in World War II. There is one story reported by the April 2, 1944 edition of the Los Angeles Times of Technical Sergeant Paul J. Posty shooting down a Focke-Wulf 190 with what I assume is a privately owned break-top .38 revolver from his B-17 Belle of the Bayous when he ran out of .50 caliber ammunition. AF.mil says it was actually an ME-109 that he shot down and that Clark Gable filmed it. But he filmed a lot of air combat stuff, and I haven't found the clip. Just thought I'd include that.